Greetings and thank you for joining us today. My name is Wayne Jennings and I'm the host for today's discussion titled Spotlight on the Intersection of Religion and Politics. What's happening? We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us here today. I'd now like to introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Dr. Jim Boyle, a member of our forum committee. He will introduce the topic and our speakers. Jim?
Good morning and welcome to this morning's forum on the intersection of religion and politics. We hope to have two wonderful speakers for this forum. Randy Partane is the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland, having come to us from the Tapestry Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Houston. Randy has a doctorate in music arts from Rice University, so he is an expert in creating harmony. Professor Elliott Ingersoll, we expect to be part of this discussion this morning, but we've had some technical difficulties and hope that he'll be with us soon. He received his bachelor's in psychology from Youngstown State University and his master's in counseling from Youngstown State and his PhD from Kent State University in counseling and education. He is the professor and chair of the Department of Counseling, Administration, Supervision, and Adult Learning at Cleveland State University. He's the author of 7 books and over 30 articles and is the winner of multiple awards in his field. I'd like to thank our speakers for being with us this morning, and I'll turn the discussion over to Randy Partane.
Thanks, Jim. Well, I feel a bit at a loss, I will say, because Elliott and I had not talked about having presenting one side and presenting another side and having a bit of a conversation. We were going to spend a lot of time in conversation because the two of us have pretty similar perspectives with some nuanced differences. We're not diametrically opposed in the way that we see this issue. But just as we are awaiting Dr. Ingersoll to join us, I'll just address the questions of the day from a perspective that evolves from the conversation that he and I had together. And hopefully we'll be joined by Elliott in a little bit, and there'll be some additional information before we do questions. But if we need to, we can just move into questions a little earlier than usual, and we'll see how things go. But one of the things that we talked about is this idea that religious belief seems to be highly politicized right now. And maybe it's because we are just living in these times. But when we look back through history, religious belief has been politicized often in human history. Even when we look back to the early Christian era, the persecution of the Christians by the Roman government was certainly a politicization of religious belief. And now it just seems that political belief or political identity has become more religious. That seems to be the real change that has happened in American society, at least. Our political affiliations seem to have taken on the level of identity that our religious affiliations have taken on. So if we say we are conservative or liberal, it has as much of a deep meaning to our identity as saying that we are Catholic or Jewish or Muslim. And there has been some intentional effort to move religion into intersection with politics, especially on the part of the conservative movement wanting to get the Christian evangelicals on their side, because it's a pretty big voting bloc in American society. It's shrinking, but it's still a significant number of people. And there's some evidence throughout the last 50 years or so that there's been a real effort to connect religious identity with political identity so that the two are a little less distinct, so that they're intertwined. I'm not sure that there's a lot of personal conflict in terms of internal conflict with religious identity and political identity today, but it certainly does seem that people are more willing to engage in interpersonal conflict based on their religious or political stances. And the thing that we discussed ahead of time that we were going to delve into a little bit today is this idea of identity and being able to recognize an authentic self in the midst of being told who we are by outside forces. And so a political party is one of the systems that tells people who they are, tells people what they should believe. If you want to have this identity, if you want to accept this label of liberal or Democrat or Republican or conservative or libertarian or green or whatever it is, there's a group of people that will tell you what you must believe and what you must accept in order to have that label. And so it takes a lot of personal maturity to say, well, I agree with this part of it, but not this other part, and to have a more nuanced label for oneself. And it's the same thing with religion. When you show up at a lot of religious institutions, there are people there that will tell you how to behave and how to think and how to believe. And if you like some aspects of that, but not other aspects of it, you have to be very mature as an individual to say, this part makes sense to me and this other part doesn't. And I'm still going to be in relationship with this community and have an individual interpretation of what it means to me to be Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Unitarian Universalist. One of the unique things about Unitarian Universalism is we encourage people to explore their own individual beliefs and to still be in community with one another. But that is not the norm for the religious landscape in America. So one of the things that Dr. Ingersoll and I both kind of have in common is we've done some personal exploration, and our personal beliefs have evolved us beyond some of the labels that we had accepted earlier in our lives. And I really do think that that's a trajectory that every person can engage in, that maturing. But there are a lot of things in our society, a lot of elements that really benefit from people not growing. There are a lot of systems that benefit from people not questioning what they're told, not questioning authority. There are a lot of systems that benefit from people staying a bit stunted in their spiritual growth or personal growth. And so it really takes a lot of internal resolve to engage in that journey and to find the resources that one needs in order to outgrow a more shallow understanding of identity and to really accept a more nuanced sense of what it means to be a self. And this is the part where we would be in deep dialogue and you'd get to hear another voice other than mine. And unfortunately, I am not seeing Dr. Ingersoll on the screen just yet. So I'm wondering if we might invite some questions and some engagement with the attendees that are here so that we have some other ideas that we might bring into the conversation.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I read recently that of evangelical Christians that 80% voted for President Trump both in 2016 and 2020, and that it has essentially become a measure of Christianity to vote Republican. I guess I'd like your comments about that. I mean, how has that evolved? It seems like I can't imagine Trump being an exemplar of Christianity, and yet there's this massive identification with he and the Republican Party.
Well, it's complicated. There's not a single answer that we can offer for why people might do that. There's a lot of people that are willing to overlook things that are important to me, for instance, because they value something different than I do. So we don't have a common set of American values that we're working from to say this person best exemplifies these American values and this person doesn't. We're a complicated group of people. And so whereas I might value someone who's going to bring about greater justice and equity in our system of government, there are people who value somebody that they believe is going to bring about a strong economy. And they look at somebody's stance on justice, and that means nothing to them. They look at someone's moral character, and it doesn't really have a lot of value to them to look at that, because what they care about most is the stability of a strong economy. And so they vote for someone that they believe is going to provide that. So for some people, they are voting on their values, and their values are just prioritized differently than mine. So there is that element of things. And we can't know that unless we engage in dialogue. We can't know what somebody values and what somebody really cares about. And unfortunately, most of the time we tell people what they ought to care about and what they ought to value instead of listening and being more curious. There are people, though, who they're powerful individuals, powerful groups of individuals who have been working since the early 70s to connect evangelical Christianity with the conservative political movement. And they've been doing that at a lot of different levels, in a lot of different ways. Right now, they're working through the court system. They have a tactic that they want to just overwhelm the courts with legislation that represents a more conservative agenda. And they know that all of those lawsuits won't get through, but then if enough do, then they'll have precedent for further things. And so that this blitz, this Operation Blitz that has been made public about their efforts in the court system are along the same lines as their efforts to affect the way people believe. And so for a couple of generations now, we've had people coming up through churches and hearing Christian propaganda alongside the Republican Party propaganda or the conservative propaganda. And it all just becomes enmeshed with each other. So that sense of identity becomes entangled. In the same way that most people who consider themselves to be on the liberal side are going to vote Democratic. They're going to vote for the party that they think most aligns with their ethos, their personal ethos, and they're maybe not going to look at some other elements of a person's competency because they're just aligning themselves with a party that they're assuming is going to do the best for them. And in a two-party system, it becomes very combative. It becomes we can be much less discerning in a two-party system than we might if we have more candidates and more parties that are on equal footing, because we're either voting for someone or we're voting against a specific other person. So votes for Trump may have been votes against someone else, and somebody was just choosing the lesser of two evils. Or a vote for Biden could have been a vote against someone else, and so somebody was just voting for the lesser of two evils. There are all kinds of reasons why people who identify as evangelical Christian would also identify as conservative and vote for someone that other folks might find a really horrible candidate for president or for school board or mayor or whatever the other options might be. But their identity is enmeshed with this label. And so it becomes much more difficult to disentangle from that and say, let me really evaluate this and vote my conscience, because there might not be a candidate out there that any of us would say that is the perfect candidate. And so we fall back on those identity labels in order to make our decisions for us.
Thanks. Regarding questions and answers, I want to remind everybody to please look for the Q&A button and type in your questions or comments. This button can be located at the bottom, top, or side of your smartphone or computer screen. If your question is chosen, will recognize you by your first name unless you hit the anonymous button. And the chat box also can be used to give us your email and name if you'd like to receive reminders of future forums. Debbie Wright and Laura Imbornoni are members of our forum committee who co-chair the question and answer session, and they will choose the questions that you type in and present them to Randy. So please type in your questions.
Thanks, Jim. That's just what I was about to recommend that Laura and Debbie join us on the screen. We do have some hand-raised people that would like to say something. Reverend Randy, is that all right with you if we let people talk here?
This is the very definition of a forum, isn't it?
Right, right. Okay. So we've got Bob Adams, who's got his hand up. Bob, you're able to unmute. There you are.
Yeah, Reverend Randy, you mentioned that some people vote on their beliefs. I was wondering if you had some rationale for making it some instead of all.
I do think that there is that identity piece that is, you know, if I am Catholic, for instance, then I'm going to vote the way that my church tells me to vote in a lot of senses. You know, not every Catholic, but some Catholics are just going to say, I don't have to think about this particular thing. I know who the candidates are that are pro-life. I know who the candidates are that are going to affirm my worldview, and I can just vote along those lines. Now, the church, no church can tell people vote for this candidate or vote for that candidate in terms of keeping their 501c3 status. There's a certain restriction there. So from the pulpit, no minister can say, vote for this candidate. But we can talk about issues, and we can talk about the issues that are important to us in maintaining that sense of identity. So if I am a Catholic that cares about what it means to be pro-life, for instance, if that's a meaningful part of my identity, then there might be a lot of other things that I don't even look at regarding the candidates. I might not look at their financial history and in terms of how they've done with fiscal maintenance. I might not look at their moral standing on a lot of other things. As long as I know that the thing that I care about is going to be accomplished through their leadership, then that gets my vote. So I don't think it's all voters, because we have so much influence from outside of us that we just accept as authoritative enough that we don't actually attend to our own values unless we have done a lot of personal work to get to that point where we can stand on our own identity without outside forces telling us what that identity needs to be.
We had Gary Shirk had his hand up a little while ago, and I put it down. Gary, do you still have a question?
No, I changed my mind.
Okay.
I would say,
And Ken Freeze has his hand up as well. Ken, do you have a question that you want to relay here? Maybe not.
Jim has a question, Wayne.
Great. Laura?
Jim's question is a good one for all of us here, I think. Could the UU practice of searching for meaning in uncertainty be useful in political situations today?
Well, I mean, as a yes or no question, I would just say yes.
Would you like to expound on that a little bit?
It's a really challenging thing. We use simple words sometimes. Sometimes Unitarian Universalists use really complicated words to express simple ideas, and we feel like we've done something meaningful because we used a $64 word. But this one it works the other way. This principle of affirming and promoting a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, that's huge and it's challenging. And to actually say that you are going to engage in a search for meaning in your life that isn't connected to any external authority, that isn't connected to anyone else telling you what you must be or what you must do in order to be a legitimate human being, that's huge in and of itself. But we also say that it needs to be a responsible search for truth and meaning, which means that my search for truth and meaning about my individual identity and my individual life is connected to the world around me. And so I have to be, if I'm going to fulfill this commitment that Unitarian Universalists have, I have to be aware that I'm responsible for how my beliefs and how my sense of truth and meaning affects the world around me. And one of the things that seems to be the case in politics now, and may have been the case in politics for a long, long, long time, is that it's very competitive and combative, and we treat it more like a sporting event where we have a team that we root for than we do a sense of responsibility for how our decisions affect everyone around us. So when we talk about things in terms of spiritual practice, one of the things that a lot of spiritual practices strive to do is to help the individual connect with, first with themselves, so that they have a deep sense of what they believe and what they find meaningful and what gives truth to their life, what they really value, but also to connect us with other people in the world around us so that we understand that we have a relationship, we have a lot of relationships, and that we have ownership of how we show up in all of those relationships. And those relationships are not just with the people in our close circles, but they're with people that we might only meet one time. We have relationships with the other drivers on the road. We have relationships with the other people that are going to the poll at the same time as us, even if we don't live in their neighborhoods, even if we don't ever see them in the daily walk of our lives, but we are in relationship with all of the other people in this country that we are electing representatives to govern. So it takes a lot to get to a point where we can say that we are really engaging in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning that has a humble honesty to it. So yes, it can be really helpful in navigating our political landscape, but it's also, it's a lot of work.
Laura, we've got a hand raised from Elizabeth Meese.
We have two hands.
And we have another hand too.
That's exciting.
So Elizabeth, you're on.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Partain. I'm sorry that I haven't been to any of your services yet. I'm pleased to finally meet you online. I have been in the church, but I didn't have an appointment to speak with you, so I didn't knock on the door.
You don't have to have an appointment to come knock on the door, but that's okay.
Well, anyways, so I put this in the chat and I'll just read what I wrote. Supreme Court Amy Coney Barrett is opposed to abortion. She appears to favor reinstituting the death penalty for some federal prisoners. The Bible indicates that human life starts at the first breath. How can so many evangelical Christians be pro-life in utero, but anti-life in certain circumstances for current living human beings? Can you make a comment, please?
I can, and also I can't speak for evangelicals. I can't speak for what any individual believes, because I think a lot of people arrive at their beliefs, they arrive at similar beliefs through multiple different channels. But I'll also say that we can look in any book of scripture and find some contradictions. In the Unitarian Universalist tradition, we say that we hold the Jewish and Christian scriptures as a source, but we say that we rely on the Jewish and Christian scriptures that encourage us to love our neighbor as ourselves in response to God's love for us. So there are certain things in the Jewish and Christian scriptures that we don't value, and we say it up front, yes, we are picking and choosing. But everybody picks and chooses, they just don't always admit it. So there are Psalms in the Jewish scriptures that say that God knit us together in our mother's wombs. And so if we think about that, the knitting together in the mother's womb being an act of God, that's a divine sacred thing for a lot of people. And so it isn't just at the first breath, even though the Bible says that in another place. The Bible says that that we're not supposed to murder folks, but then it gives a lot of praise for people who go out and commit murder in defense of their people or in retribution for wrongs against their people. It's kind of complicated, and from the surface, without having a belief system or a faith system to interpret it through, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so that's why a lot of people rely on an external structure to give them their sense of identity, because they need to interpret this through some kind of a lens, because on face value, there's a lot of contradictory information. So different religious traditions will look at things and prioritize in the same way that Unitarian Universalists say, here are our principles, and here are the sources that undergird those principles. There are a lot of religious traditions that will say, these are our ideals, and we find all of these supported in this book of scripture. They might say that it works the other way around and say, this book of scripture tells us what these ideals are, but you could support any ideals with the Christian scriptures and the Jewish scriptures. You just have to look in the right place.
Thank you.
Laura, we've got Debbie Wright has her hand up too.
Good.
Debbie?
Yeah. Hello. Thanks. This is my first time listening in. Thanks, Reverend Randy. I just had a question listening in. It seems to me when listening about identity and you know what everyone's talking about, what bugs me or frustrates me is when it seems like there's a certain contingent of people who have an identity about mistrusting science, mistrusting facts. Like the idea is that if you identify as someone who is interested in the facts and the science, that means you're an elitist. That means that you don't care about the little man, so to speak. Mostly about this, you know, the grassroots movements and stuff like that. But I don't know, you know, think about how to connect with someone. Used to using, you know, logic, and so you say, well, here's the facts, here's why you should support this, like vaccines, or here's why, you know, using philosophical art. It just, the more like the more smart you make your speech, or the more you appeal, it's like the more you're alienating people, and it's hard for me to wrap my brain around that identity of mistrust of science and facts and logic. I'll mute myself.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. And I know for a lot of liberals, we have this mindset that if other people just knew what we knew, then they would believe what we believe. If other people had the same information that we were working with, then they would draw the same conclusions, and we would have a world that reflects our vision for it. And unfortunately, it's just not true. It's so frustrating. But I don't know where the mistrust of science and the mistrust of facts come from. I do know that we've gotten really heavy into being a consumer society, and there's one thing that consumers respond to, and that's marketing. And so you always want to market your ideas or your products or whatever so that it looks as favorable as possible, and you want to make the other person's product or idea look less favorable, and that's just the way that works. What I think we miss sometimes is that people, when we come at them with our argument or our defense for things or our reason for believing what we believe, so often people take that as an attack. They don't take it as just, I'm expressing my perspective. They think, you're trying to persuade me and I need to defend myself. It's like if somebody comes at you saying, you are wrong about this really important thing, and I'm going to tell you why. I would feel a bit prickly at that too. And so this is one of the things that Elliott and I had talked about in our conversation ahead of time. So I'm glad that you're giving me an opportunity to kind of bring his thoughts into this as well. We just don't listen enough. As human beings, we do a lot more defending and trying to convince people, and we just don't listen enough. And if we could be confident enough with our own sense of who we are and what we believe and what we think, that we didn't need to defend it, and we could just be curious about other people and listen, then we might give them space to start working some things out and growing on their own, so that when we ask a question out of curiosity, people don't hear it as a challenge. They hear it as a genuine desire for us to figure out what they believe and why they believe it. So if somebody says, well, I don't trust vaccines, then I can say, how can you not trust vaccines? There's all this evidence, and then they can completely shut down because I've attacked them. Or if they say, I don't trust vaccines, I can say, well, why not? And they can tell me all of the reasons. And I can say, man, that does sound pretty convincing. How do you explain the people that seem to be doing better because they got a vaccine? Is there any sense to that? Or is that just coincidence? And then they can walk through their logic. But I don't have to tell them what the CDC says because they don't trust that. I don't have to tell them what my experience is because they haven't had that experience. I can be curious and listen and at least learn something about why somebody else is so convinced of something that seems completely unbelievable to me. And maybe then we would have a little less combativeness, a little less violence in our interactions with people who think and believe differently than we do.
Laura,
Maybe.
do you have a Q&A button question?
I do. What about Robert Adams? Has he asked his question? He's got his hand raised.
Well, Bob, if you have another question, please go.
Okay, Reverend Randy, you talked about the relationship we each have with the rest of the people in the world and the world itself. Is this in any way related to the concept of common good?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, when you get into difficult ethical decisions, I mean, it would be wonderful if we had really clear ways to bring benefit to every person equally, and that was a really clear path for us to take. But there are some challenging ethical issues. And so looking at what brings the greatest good to the greatest number of people that's an ethical stance that I think aligns with Unitarian Universalism where it can. And even then we could have some really rich conversations about what course is really going to bring the greatest good to the greatest number of people, and how do we think about that. But yeah, thinking about the common good and how I influence the common good. There's this whole ethical problem of the tragedy of the commons. And I know most of you know, I'll explain it really briefly just in case it's not something you've come across. But the tragedy of the commons is that if I own a pond in my backyard and Bob owns a pond in his backyard and we both fish from our ponds, then we feel responsible for how we treat it, how we keep it up. We want to make sure that that pond is a healthy ecosystem so that we can fish from that pond and get fish out of it that we are going to appreciate eating and all of whatever we do with those fish. If we have a pond down the street, a lake that doesn't belong to anybody, and I fish from that pond and Bob fishes from that pond, we don't necessarily have the same sense of ownership. And we might leave our trash I know Bob would never leave his trash on the edge of that lake, but we might do that. We might decide that we can take as much fish from that lake as we want. We might not think that our actions have any impact on anybody else. We might treat it like it's there just for us. That's the tragedy of the commons, that we don't recognize common property as being in some way sacred, and that we have a responsibility to other people who might use that space. So thinking about the common good and things from that perspective means that I might take some fish from that lake, but not an excessive amount. And I'm going to be careful about how I leave that space, because I know that other people are going to be making use of it as well. And it's important to me to serve the common good. So that mindset does help us recognize our relationship with people around us. And we still might come up with different ways of expressing that and different behaviors, but it at least recognizes that relationship and brings it front of mind for us. Yeah, that's a good example, Bob.
But for those people who do leave the trash and treat the distant lake as if it's there for their utilization, that's an expression of individualism, which we also encourage.
Well, yes, we do encourage individualism, but again, it's that balance between a free and responsible search
Right.
for truth and meaning.
Yeah.
So yes, I am free to believe and behave in a way that makes sense to me. And I miss all of the other principles of Unitarian Universalism. I miss a lot of principles of the liberal political spectrum if I take that individualism to the point where it harms others. If I'm harming other people, then I'm not really fulfilling all the rest of that identity. But someone who cares about the common good might decide to pick up other people's trash around that lake and to set an example and to model for people what it looks like to care for that space so that they enhance the world around them and honor those relationships.
Thank you.
We've all been talking and people have been asking you questions, and I see that people are also, saying something that they perhaps believe. It's all been about politics, religion, and I want to say secular also, because so many people identify themselves as not religious, secular, and then we bring into it ethics and principles. So one question I have for you is, to what extent are the ethics and commonly held principles of our society dependent on religious institutions that people perhaps don't identify with now? Now we have an anonymous question, so I'm giving you two here. One is real broad, and then we have an anonymous question. Religious affiliation has been losing members, especially among younger people. How can we get them back in today's secular society to thinking about what I just referred to as kind of a religious heritage and a religious opportunity in today's world? So that's two questions for you.
Yeah. Well, so the religion is serving a different purpose now than it used to in some ways. I think that religion used to be, the church used to be the place where you would get training in morality and ethics and how to be in meaningful relationship with the divine and with the world and with the people around you. And
very recently.
Yes, yes. And I don't think that the decline in religious affiliation is a decline in morality or ethics. I think that that morality and that ethics is just coming from different sources. I think people have stopped trusting the church authority as much as they used to. Some people. There have been so many scandals involving churches and ministers, and churches and their structures have not always handled those very well. We get embarrassed by that stuff and we want to hide it because we feel shame, rather than saying, hey, these are human issues and we didn't handle it very well, and here's what we're going to do moving forward so that we handle it with integrity. We don't do that kind of stuff. So people have learned that churches are not the paragons of wisdom and morality that they have claimed to be in the past. But that doesn't mean that human morality and human ethics have diminished. When you talk to people who are in younger generations, people who are in middle school and high school right now, people who are in college right now, they have a very strong sense of justice. They don't all agree on it, but they have a strong sense that they have a vision for the world around them and that they play a part in creating that vision. They are not lazy thinkers and they're not selfish thinkers. They have a strong drive to do things that make a difference in the world around them. Again, not all of them have the same politics or the same sense of what justice issues matters or the same sense of what marginalized communities deserve the most attention from them, but they do have a sense of morality and ethics that comes from somewhere. So if it's TikTok, then we're in trouble. But if they're drawing on some other sources of human ethics and human morality, then what we need to do, if we want them to come to church, and I'm not saying that they need to come to church. I know I'm a minister, I'm supposed to say they need to come to church. But if we want them to come to church, then we have to demonstrate that we are a place where they can accomplish something for their lives that they can't accomplish elsewhere. If churches become a place where we are doing the work of justice, this particular congregation says that it has a fierce commitment to justice. That's great for us to say. We have to demonstrate that and we have to live that. And if we are out in the world living that, then the young people, whatever age group they happen to be in, the people who care about those things are going to say, this is my tribe. These are the people that I can partner with and collaborate with to build the kind of world that I envision. If we are a people in our, whatever denomination, whatever congregation it happens to be, if we are a people that help people understand themselves better and engage in a meaningful interaction with the world around them, then people will show up and participate in that. They're not all going to show up to liberal religious places. Some of them are going to show up to conservative religious places and traditional places because that resonates with them. But I just think that a lot of our church behavior has become less relevant, and it isn't as necessary to do things the way that they were done in previous ages, because there are other sources now and other ways of engaging that young people are finding that they trust more and that they get more out of.
What a wonderful answer. So you're saying the way to attract people is really being those principles in our daily lives. And then that's almost like a one-on-one. I see a hand up, Wayne. I see Nancy King-Smith.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for expanding on what a fierce commitment to justice means and what it really looks like. My question is really about money in politics. And we know that since Citizens United, that it's been even more possible for those people and corporations and organizations with money to become the marketers for this consumer society. Can you say a little more about both the place of money in politics and how it relates to our values, and what we might, how we should be exploring doing it differently?
No. I mean, I can express personal opinions, but I am not an expert on that particular area. I do know, like everyone else who's been paying attention, that money makes a big difference. And I believe the reason that it makes a big difference is because of that sense of external influence. That if I have enough money, then I can message things right to influence people who are not gonna do their own research and think for themselves, and who can do their own research about everything that we vote on. So what I will say is that there are multiple paths toward justice. And and by justice, maybe I'll just broaden my definition of that and say there are multiple paths toward a just and equitable world. And one of those paths is through influencing our system of government and our political, the way that our politics influences day-to-day life. Those systems, if we influence them toward justice, then it creates a more just reality. But there are also other ways that we can use our money and our time and our resources. If the system is unjust, there are ways that we can create justice by working to circumvent or turn the system on its head, or take our resources and create the kind of world that we most want to create. And there's a lot of ways that we can use our resources, monetary and otherwise, and it does not all have to be based on what candidates get elected. In a certain sense, it doesn't matter what candidate is in office if we are using our resources and our money wisely to create something different. It would be helpful if we had partnership at the higher levels of government. That's all I can really say about that.
We have a very interesting question from Dal. What about the people who have value systems different than ours and are threatening the future of all of us? So that sounds like a value system different from ours. People putting money above doing what we need to do to prevent massive environmental damage are currently blocking any effective responses to the crisis. There are now 5 young people on a hunger strike in front of the White House pushing for environmental action. What if there's no time to talk to all the blockers? What is our responsibility here in regard to action for justice?
There are definitely people with different value systems than ours. And some of them are so committed to that value system that my curiosity in questioning them and being a non-threatening presence in a conversation, it's not going to make any difference. They're still going to believe what they believe. I'm still going to believe that it's harmful to the planet and humanity, and we're not going to do anything differently just because I have a curious, detached interest in what's going on there. I do think that a lot of it comes down to the way that we have built a system of consumerist identity. I hesitated to use that word, but I do think that we identify a lot of times as consumers, and we decide what we're going to buy based on what's going to be the best value. And let's face it, it takes a little more money to shop ethically than it does to just get what I need. If I need food, then I have to spend a little more money to get my food from ethical resources rather than just get the cheapest thing that I can put on the table. And so there's a lot of wrap up in wealth and privilege and how we see our relationship with the planet. And that's what we've built. So that's the system that we have right now. There are a lot of people that believe that we have passed a point of no return with the environment, and that we're just on borrowed time right now. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't have a crystal ball about the future, but what I do know is that community is going to be the thing that helps the human race survive. Whatever happens with the environment, whatever happens with our political system, if we understand how to build strong community, then we're going to have a shot. And we're going to have a shot at building a better world, whatever the future holds, if we understand how to do a community that creates a sense of authentic integrity to our values of justice and equity and compassion. And we have to do that in small ways before we can do that at a major scale. There aren't a whole lot of places where that's happening, but if we shine a spotlight on the places where people have built that kind of community and are behaving in a way that reflects our values, and we lift that up and we talk about it and we praise that and we pour money on that and we put time and energy into that, then those are going to be the things that get to influence the future. But if we expect the larger system to change because some people are sitting outside the White House or blogging about something, then I think we're wasting our time. We have to make those things important. And I guess accessible is the other word that I'd say. We have to make those things important and accessible so that it's not just the more elite people that can take meaningful action toward ethical behavior.
Thank you. And Wayne, I see we have Robert with a question. I thought it might be good to go to the Q&A since some people are using Q&A, and then we'll go to Robert. Would that make sense, Wayne?
Yeah, Jim has had his hand up too.
Oh, good. Okay, I didn't see that. I have the Q&A up on the screen. Jim.
So there was a meeting recently in South Bend, Indiana, of post-evangelicals. Ministers from all over the country came there because they have a feeling that they want their churches to be more affirming and also open to curiosity and inclusion over exclusion. It all sounded very Unitarian to me. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Well, yeah, I think that sometimes we lose out when we are not in dialogue with other faith traditions and religious communities around us, and we start to think that we're special when really there are a lot of other people, a lot of other communities that care about the same things we do and that believe very similarly to us. It used to be that universalism was a heresy. The idea that every person was going to go to heaven and that nobody was going to go to hell for eternity, that was a heresy in the Christian church. And in some circles, it still is. And yet over the last more than a century now, that idea has been filtering through a lot of other faith traditions. It's not unique to universalism. It's been filtering through the Presbyterian church. So there are a lot of Universalist Presbyterians now, if you start talking to them about their theology. It's been filtering through the Baptist church. You know, there was a pretty famous Baptist minister, and I forget his name now, Rob Bell, I think, that came out as Universalist, and the Southern Baptist Association said, "You're out of here." But he kept on being a minister, and he kept having a pretty valuable ministry, preaching love, essentially. And so I think that some of the ideas that used to be revolutionary are now becoming more and more mainstream. And what was revolutionary for the Unitarian Universalists a little while back was saying, you know what? We are stronger when we have a multicultural community. We are stronger when we support a faith community that is diverse and that welcomes a breadth of ideas and that honors people's identities. And we've done pretty well when it comes to LGBTQ identity. We have not done so well when it comes to the multiculturalism part. And we're still working on it. And other faith traditions are catching up with us. So if we want to be revolutionary and if we want to be the standard bearers into the future in terms of what beloved community looks like, we really do have to step up our game and put our actions, put our words into action. But this gathering of post-evangelicals is also really encouraging because it means that we've got a lot of partners in this and that we are not standing all by ourselves out in the wilderness saying, here's a way toward a better future. There are other people that are recognizing the same things that we have recognized and that we have lifted up. And that if we seek out partnership across the lines of religious identity, then we might find some really powerful opportunities to create community that challenges what those labels have looked like in the past and that builds something a little deeper for the future of humanity.
Well, Jim and Randy, I will say that I have I have friends in Nashville, and who has a family member who happens to be an evangelical minister. I've been to his church several times, and you know what? He says such wise, intelligent things. Really? And obviously has read current philosophy that a lot of us who are very liberal have read, the kinds of things that are, groundbreaking things, and quotes those things. But it's an evangelical church. And I have to say, I listen to right-wing radio when I'm in my car. There are very intelligent people who speak often. And they say a lot of things that my liberal friends say, like, we could lose this country. They say the other side doesn't really listen to us. They say a lot of things that are very similar to what we say. So where do we go from here? One of the anonymous questions is, religion and politics are both power-based. So they want people to join their mission. There's definitely competition, and I just spoke about that competition. And so this person says, isn't there competition? And then how does this all get resolved? How do we build a bridge?
Well, I think there's competition precisely because of what you're saying. There's a perspective of power that creates an inherent sense of competition. And if we want to have less of a sense of competition, we have to change the way that we think about power, which means our egos have to be a little less involved And that's individually and as communities. Our ego has to take a little bit of a back seat, and we have to be interested in shared power. Power is not the scarce commodity that we treat it like sometimes. When we use it well, power magnifies. And when we are able to collaborate with other people in an authentic, meaningful way, then that shared power becomes greater than what all of that competitive power can create. Because that competitive power just wastes energy. We're trying to prove ourselves better than somebody else, and we waste energy on that rather than accomplishing the things that are really important for us to accomplish. So when we are able to find meaningful places of collaboration as individuals, as communities, and share power and let our egos get out of the way, then we can create a different way of doing the things that we care about. But that's a different way of conceiving of power. And that takes a lot of, I mean, you talk about a use for spiritual practices, that takes a lot of internal work to get to a point where we can say, all right, my preferences are not the important thing here. This value and how it's going to be carried forward in the world is the important thing. And this collaboration and this shared partnership is a meaningful way to do that. That takes a whole shift in the way that we think about power. So that's a way that our religious institutions can reinforce things. If we hear that from the pulpit, if we get that in our small groups, if we have that in our religious conversations, then it's going to be a way that we retrain ourselves to think about power differently. But we also have to recognize that the rest of the world is not going to start doing power differently just because we do. And so it requires us to have that resilience to do something that is countercultural and to express power in a way that doesn't look like the political power structure that we have. But that is what happens when social justice movements rise up. When you look at what Black Lives Matter, that's what my mask is today, Black Lives Matter. When you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, that's an example of how people have said, we do not need to rely on the systems of power that currently exist. We can do something different, and we can have an uprising, and we can have a groundswell of justice-related activity that doesn't rely on other people approving of us and getting approval from some hierarchy of power that says, yeah, what you're doing is okay, and you have permission to do that. So there are examples, recent examples that we can say, here's people who are using power, conceiving of power differently, and maybe there are ways to collaborate, maybe there are ways to model things off of those groups. Just some initial thoughts. We could go on for an hour about that. And I'm really, I'm disappointed that Elliott was not here to join in this conversation, because he has, I have some similar things to say that he does, but he does have a unique perspective. And I hope that you have an opportunity to hear some of his thoughts at some point in time. I know he's done some public talks that are on video, and you can find them online. And he's local, so there might be opportunities to connect with him in other ways as well. I think that our conversation was very rich, and I was hopeful that you would have an opportunity to hear us talk to each other, just with you being flies on the wall. But I know we have just a limited amount of time left, so I want to maximize just the next 5 or 10 minutes.
Yes.
I have a service to do this morning at 11,
Yes.
so.
Do you have time for one more question or not?
I have time for one more, sure.
Well, we've been going back and forth between Q&A and the raised hand, and Robert's had his hand up a long time. And I think that the comments and questions from him have been so interesting. I can't wait to hear what this one is. Can we unmute him, Wayne?
He can unmute himself.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to comment that I have long thought, and Reverend Randy's recent conversations from Laura and Randy have illustrated to me that the UU organization in general is a massive unconscious experiment in how to manage diversity. And you have both provided some evidence that the actual expressions of our management ideas are spreading. So thank you very much.
thanks, Bob. Some people talk about the Unitarian Universalist Association as a hierarchical power structure, and I remind people a lot that Unitarian Universalism is congregationally based. So it is an association of congregations. So each congregation contributes to what the identity of the Unitarian Universalist Association is. And so when those congregations are having disagreements of ideas, then it's going to be reflected by conflict in the larger association. But when those smaller congregations are in sync, then that also is reflected in the way that the association handles things. And it's not unique to Unitarian Universalism. If every Catholic congregation in the country decided that they were going to take a particular ethical stance or a particular moral stance on something, it would not matter what the Pope says. I know that's sacrilegious, but if that groundswell of people in any denomination and in any secular organization, if that groundswell of people said, listen, this is what justice looks like, this is what morality looks like, this is what ethical relationship looks like, and we are committed to it, it does not matter what whoever's at the top of that perceived power structure says. People have power, and communities of people have communal power. And the more that we can recognize that we have ownership, we have responsibility for the power that we have, then I think the greater good we'll be able to do in the world, and the greater harmony we'll be able to bring, because we're going to be looking for those collaborations and looking for places where, even if we don't seem to agree with somebody at those large labels of identity, there are places where we have intersections of morality, of ethics, things like feeding people who are hungry. There's a lot of food insecurity anywhere you look in this country. And there are people on every side of the political spectrum that care about that. And so those kinds of issues are places to start building relationship and finding additional common ground, so that we can say, hey, we're sharing partnership in this. Maybe there are some other places. What else do you care about? And maybe we'll find out, taking care of food insecurity is the only thing that we have in common with some other people, and that's okay too.
I want to thank
Jim.
I want to thank Reverend Randy for a wonderful presentation this morning on this important and very misunderstood topic of the interaction of religion and politics. This has been a model of how you deal with adversity. You just really stepped up to the plate and handled everything, even though things didn't work right at the start, and that Professor Ingersoll was not able to be with us. You're my hero, is all I can say. Thank you very much. I'd like to say that next week's forum is on police reform, treatment versus incarceration, with Scott Osecki, who's the CEO of Cuyahoga County Alcohol and Drug Addiction and Mental Health Services. And we hope that you'll all be with us again for that. And we also would like to invite all of you to attend our Unitarian service this morning at 11. The service will be conducted via YouTube. To participate, go to uucleveland.org, check on the green box in the upper right-hand side of the website. The YouTube link will take you to the service. Today's sermon is Put This Song on Replay, and Reverend Randy will be talking about how to change habits and routines that may no longer being serving a useful purpose in your life. So thank you everyone for participating this morning, and thank you, Reverend Randy.
It was my great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Can you come in person also, Reverend Randy, today?
Yes, we are meeting in person. We do have some precautions to keep everyone healthy with the pandemic still having some high numbers in our county, but we are meeting in person in the sanctuary with some special protocols in place.
Thank you.
Okay, I've stopped the recording.